Hello, and welcome to United for Peace, Episode 1.6, ONUC in Retrospect. Before we begin today, let me run down the things I want to cover this episode. From the very beginning, ONUC was supposed to help rebuild the civilian economy in the Congo alongside the military missions. I will summarize some of the key contributions ONUC made on the civilian side. I will also discuss some of the political controversies of the mission, lessons the UN drew, what the mission ultimately accomplished for the Congo, and what more, if anything, it could have done. First, let us cover the civilian contributions ONUC made to the Congo. After all, the civilian aspect was an essential part of the mission, but I have thus far neglected it. Throughout the operation, approximately $50.3 million equivalent was granted to civilian aid projects through the UN Fund for the Congo. That amount equals about $483 million by today's dollar value. This does not include $48 million that the United States contributed to a special import support fund, that is, a fund used to help facilitate the importation of necessary goods into the Congo. This is not necessarily an amount to scoff at, but it does fall significantly short of the $100 million of direct aid that Secretary General Hammarskjöld estimated, with the help of experts and consensus of the General Assembly, that the Congo would need to attain economic sustainability. It was clear that economic, civil, and educational sectors would deteriorate once ONUC withdrew. Nonetheless, this fund and the services provided by ONUC and the aid projects it initiated prevented a total disintegration of these sectors upon withdrawal. So, what sort of projects were ONUC engaged in on the civilian front? To start, ONUC recognized that the Congo would need trained personnel capable of carrying out a diverse array of technical and administrative functions to become self-sufficient once ONUC's mandate ended. When the Congo gained formal independence from Belgium, only 7 native Congolese people had college degrees. This does not mean only 7 people were qualified for leadership or administrative positions, of course, but it does mean that there weren't many people with a healthy idea of how a modern state operates, or how to run and maintain an enormous national telecommunications network, for instance. I can't nail down an exact number, since the last report on civilian aid I could find precedes the end of the mission by about 2 years, and secondary sources I read do not provide an exact number. However, ONUC established over a dozen training schools throughout the lifespan of the mission. By 1964, nearly 9,500 Congolese citizens had been enrolled in at least one ONUC training course, while 332 had gotten support to study abroad. Training and education provided by ONUC-sourced experts covered almost all areas of modern life, such as agriculture, communications, customs, education, health, labor, police, public administration, public works, and social affairs. And, just for reference, these areas all encompass diverse subjects. For instance, communications covers, among other things, civil aviation and even meteorology. That's just a taste of how diverse training and education was under ONUC projects. Beyond this, ONUC provided foreign teachers while training new domestic ones to take their place once they left, recognizing that they would need to drastically increase the number of native students. With the assistance of UNESCO personnel, Congolese educational professionals drafted a revised education plan which would convert many usable spaces into classes and school facilities while raising new teachers. By the school year of 1961 through 1962, over 54,000 pupils had been enrolled in secondary education compared to 28,000 in the 1959 through 1960 school year. Over 200 Congolese citizens had been enrolled in teacher training by the end of 1962. Interestingly, about 50 were people who had never completed high school but passed a special entrance exam and would be prepared to teach primary school. Between 1963 and 1964, there were 3 times as many students enrolled in secondary school as in the school year 1959 to 1960. Importantly, most of these students were actually Congolese. This stark uptick in school enrollment would not have been possible without teachers provided by ONUC, which also intentionally provided the nation with the resources it would need to eventually break its dependence on foreign teachers. Well, that was the intention anyway. The chaos which engulfed the Congo as ONUC left and after the withdrawal all but ensured that student enrollment would decline in the aftermath of the operation. That about covers the broad strokes of ONUC's education and training programs. Any more detail would probably bore you to death, and a rabbit hole of data could probably fill 2 or more hours. So what else did ONUC do on the civilian front? Well, most aspects of state operation essentially disintegrated when Belgium withdrew. ONUC's civilian staff reactivated and staffed airports, the national railway system, the postal service, and telecommunication centers. Literally, any conceivable civil service people expect of a government had dissolved and needed a reboot, so to speak. ONUC also provided over 800 secondary school teachers, nearly 200 doctors and other medical personnel, and 47 legal experts to support a civil sector of the nation and the government. If you wonder about primary school teachers, don't worry. ONUC found they could staff primary schools with domestic teachers for the most part, as you may have suspected from that special exam I mentioned, where applicants were found suitable to prep to teach primary school. What's more, ONUC brought in experts to improve administrative functions in the Congo. This came in 2 forms: streamlining administration and reviving essential administrative functions. The most notable example of streamlining is that when the Congo gained independence, control of the postal service was split between 3 separate ministries. Receiving advice from ONUC administrative experts, the Republic of the Congo centralized funding and began the process of centralizing personnel control into 1 ministry. The lack of citizens with secondary and post-secondary education made apparently obvious problems like this fairly common. With regards to revival of administrative services, the main thing is the strengthening of the almost completely destroyed customs system throughout the Congo. Relations broke down between the Central Customs Directorate of the Congo and provincial customs offices. Further, control posts and customs offices in general were left unstaffed or staffed with underqualified individuals. This had a disastrous effect on the central government's revenue stream and ability to raise foreign reserves. For instance, the Congolese government, even though it was still under Belgian control, raised about $35 million worth of foreign reserves in 1959 from diamond exports. In 1961, diamond exports only raised $750,000 worth of reserves, even though real diamond output did not decline considerably. Trading from areas not under central government control accounts for some of this decline, but clandestine trading from the rest of the Congo accounts for much of it as well. After ONUC sent experts to posts and offices in Bukavu, Albertville, and Le Louisbourg, at the Central Customs Directorate's request, the Directorate also requested that they post at least 1 expert at each important customs office in the Congo. The government was pleased with the services they were receiving, obviously. Makes sense. ONUC provided on-location training and advice for staff and generally improved efficiency while also providing training classes for new staffers. In addition to this, ONUC restored relations between the Central Customs Directorate and the provincial offices, restoring cohesion to the national customs system, even if it could not prevent all clandestine trade. ONUC air and road transport was essential to getting central government officials to provincial and frontier areas to communicate personally with relevant figures and establish control plans. That last bit gets us to another important aspect of ONUC civilian assistance, its infrastructure work. I already mentioned that ONUC experts and staff restarted service for telecommunication centers, airports, and railroads, which are obviously important components of a nation's infrastructure, but there were still more infrastructure problems. Military action and unprecedented flooding caused many roads and bridges to be destroyed outright, preventing the movement of goods to market and the distribution of aid. ONUC undertook several projects to restore the most important bridges and roadways, in addition to providing equipment and training necessary for Congolese organizations to continue the work elsewhere. ONUC's help developing the Congo's telecommunication services went notably well. By late 1962, handling of telecommunication services had mostly been handed over to Congolese personnel, with ONUC-sourced experts providing mostly advisory assistance by this time. In addition, ONUC helped build up domestic training courses for new telecommunications personnel, and a large volume of equipment was donated by West Germany to assist in a plan drafted by ONUC to greatly expand the telephone network throughout the country. The telephone network in the Congo, upon gaining independence, did not even adequately link the national capital to all provincial capitals, just for reference. This is why road and air transport was essential for maintaining relations between the Central Customs Directorate and the provincial offices, just for reference. Now, when I discussed road and bridge construction, I mentioned that movement of goods to market and aid distribution were the primary concerns regarding road infrastructure. Market access and flow in general was a grave concern during the Congo crisis, which ONUC took seriously. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization sent experts to survey the agricultural situation. After all, the agricultural sector made up most of the Republic of the Congo's economy. They found that the main issues in the agricultural sector were political and socio-economical more than anything else, so problems at that level had to be solved to really improve the agricultural situation. Nonetheless, the near-total collapse of public functions pushed ONUC to provide training classes for agricultural mechanics so that farmers would be able to keep their machinery in working order. ONUC also took the initiative in organizing transportation groups with available trucks in order to revive road transportation to restore market access for many farmers. All of this added up to making sure farms could still operate normally and that farmers could actually sell their produce. Speaking of trucks for transportation, by 1962, the Congo had only half as many vehicles present as it had by the end of 1959, allowing far less cargo to be transported than before gaining independence. Some vehicles were shipped out as many Belgians withdrew from the country. Some were destroyed during the internal conflict. In any case, ONUC drew up a plan with the central government which would import 1,200 trucks into the country by 1964, increasing the total stock of domestic vehicles by 25%. This may not bring the country back to the level of available transportation it had back in 1959, but it would ensure that just about anyone concerned would be able to move goods to market. There were more issues than transportation when it came to market flow, however. Accessing and using money was a problem too. Due to the shortage of experienced administrative personnel and endemic violence, banks throughout the country were hardly functioning, money was difficult to transport safely, and there were issues with sending and processing checks or money orders. Until 1961, when a new government was formed, separatist administrations in the provinces could not be relied upon to honor their obligations in the postal service check and money order systems. So, for a while, much business activity could only take place at local levels or with cash, which rather hinders development. Once the new government formed and provincial administrations fell in line, services resumed, though on a limited scale due to the circumstances. Now, ONUC could be said to have enabled this or caused the problem in the first place. it was largely because of Mobutu's coup in 1960, abetted by ONUC, that separatism became such a major issue, Katanga and South Kasai's prior secession notwithstanding. On the other hand, the Postal Service simply was not functioning at all until ONUC staff got services started back up. So, whether or not ONUC caused the disruption in check and money order postal services by abetting Mobutu's coup, these services simply would not have existed at all between 1960 and 1961, if not for ONUC's aid. If it sounds like I'm making light of Mobutu's coup and the UN's role in it, don't worry, we will return to that when I go over political controversies. But first, one more thing about the money issue. Money supply and availability was so bad that at one point, ONUC literally flew 110 million Congo francs from Leopoldville to Kivu province in order to ensure that people could purchase cotton from local growers and banks could issue loans. They just had to fly a boatload of cash. Literally just a boatload of cash. Or I suppose an airplane's load of cash. Anyway. This guaranteed the survival and harvest of a crop, and then provided the funds for farmers to sow another crop. That is, the mere transfer of physical currency enabled the provincial rural economy to actually sustain itself to any extent whatsoever. So that covers the important details about ONUC civilian aid. I could go into more detail about where they sent doctors and nurses to provide medical assistance, or how they fixed up the country's railroad signals, but I don't think many people out there want to hear details that minute. Plus, none of the public documents showed how they fixed up the railroad signals. I looked. Now, let's talk about something far juicier, the political controversies of the operation. First of all, we need to talk about why the UN did not help put down secessionist states right off the bat, even though the rebellions were clearly undermining the Republic of the Congo's consolidation. Security Council Resolution 143, which authorized ONUC in the first place, quote, authorized the Secretary General to provide the government with such military assistance as may be necessary until the national security forces may be able, in the opinion of the government, to meet fully their tasks. End quote. And putting down a rebellion is clearly an essential task of the security forces, and the Congo did in fact request assistance for this particular task. However, Hammarskjöld believed that a rebellion entirely within the country's borders constituted a domestic political issue more than anything else. Well, okay, so what? Well, Article 2 of the UN Charter states, quote, nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state, end quote. So, Hammarskjöld thought it obvious that the UN could not intervene against the secessions taking place entirely within the Congo's borders, since they were matters of domestic jurisdiction, and as such, SC Resolution 143 could not possibly be interpreted as authorizing such intervention. The UN operation in the Congo ended up being the first time the UN directly intervened in an internal conflict. Every peacekeeping operation before ONUC concerned ending hostilities between the forces of internationally recognized states. ONUC's primary role was supposed to be nothing more than making sure that foreigners did not involve themselves in the Congo crisis, and making sure that the Congo could recover from said crisis. The hope with this latter goal was that a stronger Congo government would discourage future international interventions. And, they wanted the Congo to do well, because humanitarian organizations are like that. Anyway, as we saw with the actions of Patrice Lumumba and his disciples like Antoine Gizenga, the Congo central government's failure to end Katanga's secession undermined its political legitimacy in the eyes of many. This, in turn, certainly undermined ONUC's latter objective. However, Hammarskjöld was not willing to do anything that could be perceived to be in contradiction to the UN Charter. To do so would essentially be to contravene international law. In the end, ONUC only suppressed the Katanga secession on account of its continual employment of foreign mercenaries and European advisors, who often held commissions in the officer corps of their homelands. It was not clear until after the first couple engagements between ONUC and Katangese forces that these foreign supporters were essentially the sole reason Katanga was able to sustain its independence in the first place. Otherwise, ONUC may have acted much sooner to suppress the secession. There is no correct opinion to have concerning whether or not ONUC should have acted sooner to end the Katanga secession. Intel on the Congo interior was not exactly extensive at this time, so it took a long time and some direct clashing to size up the strengths and weaknesses of Katanga. Some say that, given Security Council Resolution 143's directive to provide military assistance as needed until Congolese security forces could fulfill all of its duties, ONUC should have either taken over all ANC duties for the sake of them ending Katanga's secession, or they should have fought Katanga themselves as soon as possible. On the other hand, the UN is intentionally set up to be institutionally incapable of intervening in the domestic affairs of sovereign states willy-nilly. The specific purpose of this is to prevent the organization from turning itself into a world government, and to prevent great powers from using it to consolidate their own interests, even if it does get used that way to an extent. Remember, the UN had only existed for 13 years when the Congo crisis started, so it could hardly sustain the loss of credibility and legitimacy that would accompany violating some of its most carefully considered regulations, which people called for simply to have their states join the UN in the first place and get it off the ground. That said, Chapter 7 of the UN Charter gives the Security Council broad permission to use non-military and military force to restore international peace and security. Although the Katanga secession was entirely domestic in the sense that the fighting was entirely internal to Katanga, there was clearly an international dimension to it. For one, the secession was backed by Belgium. This may not have been known by the time Hammarskjöld flew out to meet with Tshombe, however. Yes, Belgian administrators were in Katanga while they had pulled out of the rest of the Congo, but that doesn't necessarily mean Belgium itself was involved. Besides that, however, foreign states did nothing to stop the recruitment of mercenaries within their borders. Furthermore, there is the matter of the mercenary-operated jet we've talked about a few times, which probably operated out of Rhodesia. Even UN commanders at the time suspected this. So there's a bit of the conflict taking place across international borders here. So, taking the position that ONUC should have immediately gone after Katanga means adopting an expansive interpretation of what constitutes a breach of or threat to international peace, and consequently an expansive interpretation of when the UN may decide to deploy armed forces in pursuit of its policies. This is a potentially dangerous can of worms, considering how suspicious people already are of this supranational organization's powers and its potential to override state sovereignty. And, bear in mind, I said this was the 5th ever official peacekeeping mission, but it was only the second armed peacekeeping mission, the first one being the United Nations Emergency Force, which basically just made sure that there were no violations across an armistice line. But now, back to the suspicion that the UN would try to override state sovereignty. That is the whole purpose of Article 2, the one that Hammarskjöld used to argue that the UN could not intervene against Katanga, to assure skeptics that the UN is not going to turn itself into some global quasi-government. It is merely a forum for states to air grievances, request support, cooperate on major issues, and for great powers to work things out before another world war is liable to kick off. Moving on though, perhaps the greatest political controversy on ONUC's record is its role in Mobutu's coup against Lumumba. Since ONUC was at the very least complicit in, if not an active part of, a coup against a leftist head of government in the Congo, and a pro-Western government stood at the end of the operation, it is easy to say that ONUC is just another example of the UN, a liberal organization, imprinting the predominantly Western ideology onto a developing state which could have done better with some other system. Also, if it wouldn't fight Katanga because its secession was a purely domestic matter, then how can they justify abetting a coup? This doesn't work for a few reasons, however. Sure, the UN did everything it could to keep a parliamentary republic in power over a united Congo, and provided technical economic assistance in a manner consistent with market economics, but capitalism was not necessarily the end goal here. This was merely going along with the Republic of the Congo's constitution as it stood upon gaining independence. In July 1962, in the middle of a prolonged period of emphasis on civilian programs, ONUC brought in personnel from the International Labor Organization who specialized in co-op planning and management, figuring that the mostly rural Congo, with millions of impoverished farmers, could produce a lot more if people organized into co-ops. Essentially, they were seriously considering supporting the establishment of voluntary collective farms and worker-owned small manufactories in the Congo. And again, the Congo was a predominantly rural country, so a widespread adoption of cooperative farming and employee-owned manufactories would essentially make voluntary collectivism the backbone of the nation's economy. And this is essentially what the UN's relevant experts and the advisors they brought in figured would be best for the Congo given its demographics and economic situation. The largest agricultural co-op formed comprised around 400 families in Djili, a suburb of Leopoldville. It was originally founded by just 97 members, so as you can see, it must have been an extremely attractive option for struggling farmers in the area. Is this a somewhat weak and isolated example of ONUC subverting traditional, capital L, liberal values? Admittedly so. But it is a good example of how ONUC considered, first and foremost, what may be the most beneficial for the Congo given its specific circumstances at this time, and was clearly willing to contravene traditional, big L, liberal values. So, it couldn't be merely a means of imposing liberalism on the Congo. A parliamentary government, cooperative production methods, and a steady increase in industrial capacity could theoretically stabilize the politics and economy of the country for years to come. Of course, none of these things were stabilized, but that's more owing to the multitude of different tensions built up over decades of Belgian colonial rule and the lack of unity in political or social vision in the Congo. Many people wanted to return to ancient tribal traditions. Others wanted to set themselves or their preferred strongmen up as dictators. Others still legitimately wanted a liberal or socialist democracy. In the end, whoever had the most soldiers loyal to them had the final say in the matter, and others with soldiers of their own openly challenged all others. ONUC simply could not maintain its presence for long enough in a powerful enough capacity to settle all these political and social matters. This is especially true since doing so would necessarily mean making overarching decisions about the country's systems not necessarily according to domestic consensus, which would betray the UN's values and basic principles of national sovereignty. These values and principles had already been betrayed in a few instances over the course of the mission. However, the UN's leadership really is committed to upholding them, believe it or not. Those who do not demonstrate such commitment generally do not get the positive attention it takes to get promotions within the organization. Those who fail to uphold these principles do not do so for lack of commitment, typically, but lack of competence or information, if anything. If there is anything ONUC could have done to leave the Congo stronger and more stable, it would have been to assist in putting down the Kimba and Kwilu rebellions. These rebellions went a long way to destabilizing Congo politics until democratic governance collapsed entirely, giving way to a military dictatorship which kept most Congolese people incredibly poor while enriching an infinitesimally small clique of strongmen. However, the UN operation in the Congo nearly bankrupted the organization as it was, and so remaining in force to suppress these rebellions, which also would have violated Article 2 of the Charter, forbidding any intervention in purely domestic matters, that is, again, was not a real possibility for the UN. More on that later. When it became clear to the public that Adula was unable to effectively govern the country, Chombe ended up replacing him as head of government. That's right, those conditions of Katangi's reintegration we covered last time were brewing towards Chombe's national takeover. Well, takeover in heavy quotes. President Kasavubu, reacting to the ongoing Kwilu and Simba rebellions and Adula's failure to suppress them, dismissed Adula from his post as prime minister and replaced him with Moise Chombe. So, Mr. Chombe ended up prime minister of the Congo by legal means. What a turnaround. But it doesn't matter in the end, because he too was ineffective, and in 1965, Mobutu launched yet another military coup and ruthlessly ruled over the Congo all the way until 1997. Evidence is not wholly clear, but he probably had US support. This wouldn't be unreasonable. The US had already provided support so he could launch a coup in 1960, if you recall. Plus, Mobutu did everything he could throughout his rule to make sure Western companies had access to dirt-cheap mineral resources while staunchly opposing leftist politics in all forms. So, the outcomes of ONUC are mixed at best, but if the UN can be faulted for any of the negative outcomes, it is on account of not remaining in the Congo for long enough rather than for having come at all. Nation building, especially on the economic side, which was a part of the operation's mandate after all, takes years. ONUC stayed for months after concluding armed operations. The United Nations did not pull out for operational reasons either. The UN pulled out because it took on massive debts to finance ONUC, and the USSR failed to deliver the financial contributions it had promised, and the organization nearly went bankrupt as a result. Furthermore, ONUC ceased to serve any purpose for the key players of the Security Council. The Soviets failed to gain a foothold in Africa, Western commercial interests were secured, a Western-friendly government ruled in the newly renamed Kinshasa, that is former Leopoldville. So, just to summarize, the lack of political will and financial resources made it so the UN really didn't have any realistic options on the table for doing any more for the Congo. Politics are kinda sad that way. But ONUC was not a total loss. Reintegrating Katanga into the Congo at large, even if it didn't necessarily guarantee the country's economic health, ensured there would be no significant realignment of power in Central Africa. Despite its wealth, Katanga was still a fairly weak and vulnerable territory on its own. There were plausible rumors about plans to incorporate Katanga into Northern Rhodesia or some other white-dominated Central African political union. This very well could have paved the way for continual white imperial domination in the middle of the continent. Now, that's just with Katanga being incorporated into a politically white-dominated state or political union. there is also a reasonable possibility that the Congo as a whole would have collapsed without the economic advantages of holding Katanga. If the Congo at large fell, the entire vast territory could have fallen under the control of an apartheid state, essentially negating all the benefits of independence from Belgium and sustaining white domination in South and Central Africa well into the 21st century. Furthermore, ONUC did in fact keep the Congo from becoming essentially a client state of European powers or the Soviet Union. Some might argue that Mobutu's dictatorship, which left the Congo, although one of the most resource-rich nations in the world, one of the poorest on average, is not exactly a better option than the former, but at least the people of the Congo now have the possibility to fight for what they want without fighting foreign armies as well. Having said all that, there is but one thing left to discuss. What, if anything, did the UN learn from all of this? Firstly, the experience of ONUC demonstrated for the first time in the UN's existence just how differently a peacekeeping mission must operate when it is directly involved in a civil conflict rather than simply enforcing an international ceasefire. The mandate must provide stronger directives, but with more freedom of action to commanders and troops on the ground. Explicitly political objectives must be set and achieved, and there are no clear lines for peacekeepers to set up along. All because civil conflicts tend to be extremely fluid situations, often with rapidly shifting alliances and axes of power. In light of all this, the UN created the Special Committee on Peacekeeping to consider peacekeeping challenges and opportunities and make recommendations regarding peacekeeping missions thereafter. ONUC also revealed that the political will of the UN's member states and the Security Council were much more relevant than charter references when it came to deciding what a mission could and could not do. As we have now seen, ONUC declined to intervene against Katanga due to regulations set by Article 2 of the UN Charter, but the UN ended up pursuing the end of its secession anyway, because another Secretary General and the members of the Security Council agreed that it was in everyone's best interest. Sure, it could be argued that there was an international dimension to the Katanga secession, but then you have ONUC's armed intervention against Antoine Gizenga's breakaway republic, which had absolutely no foreign support except nominal recognition from 3 countries. So, essentially, the UN can do what it wants when acting in accordance with the international consensus. It still cannot practically violate its regulations unilaterally, but when the global community it represents agrees on something, the possibilities are essentially endless. Consensus building continues to make up the bulk of the UN's activities to this day. Another lesson from ONUC is that quick responses are absolutely essential. Rapid response forces were not a thought to anyone at the time of the operation, but Dag Hammarskjöld reckoned that there was very little time to salvage the situation whatsoever when the Congo crisis kicked off. Deploying armed forces within 48 hours seems to have saved the Congo from complete disintegration. Battalions advancing ahead of headquarters may have caused logistical and organizational issues, but the effects they had on local populations greatly reduced random violence, lawlessness, and political breakdown. The first force commander, General Karl van Horn of Sweden, turned out to be incapable of competently commanding troops in combat zones, so Hammarskjöld found a way to operate through his military advisor, the now familiar General Inderjit Rikhye of India. To this day, Secretaries General of the UN are well versed in the various mechanisms through which they can influence ground operations if commanders are not performing satisfactorily. Yet another lesson learned is that forces like ONUC should enter into conflict zones armed to par with warring parties. Lightly armed peacekeepers are at the mercy of combatants, and cannot always be resupplied or reinforced in the field. If they are at the mercy of combatants, they can be taken hostage and used as leverage to prevent the usage of heavy weapons or equipment thereafter. So, best for peacekeepers in the field to already have these readily available. UN peacekeepers before were only lightly armed, since their role was to simply stop fighting from happening between other parties. Taking an active role, however, as they now sometimes do, requires more firepower. Finally, ONUC showed the world that the long-term task of nation building is an essential component of building and maintaining peace. This is the lesson the UN itself drew, and is a pretty good way of phrasing it. I, for one, would be more broad and say, rather than simply nation building, consensus building between stakeholders and development are critical to peace. Military activities and humanitarian aid were coordinated together in ONUC, but leaders were convinced that the job of aid began where the soldier's job ended. Troops themselves need to play an active role in humanitarian aid for it to be truly successful. Otherwise, once the troops leave, more political shenanigans or new rebellions, like the Simba or Kwilu rebellions, can undo so much progress in the blink of an eye and perpetuate conflict. Ah, wait, here's a bonus lesson. The operation was so controversial and expensive that, rather than drawing meaningful doctrinal conclusions from it, the UN simply decided it would never engage in such a mission again. It would be many decades before the UN would authorize a mission nearly as large as ONUC again. Remember when I said that the Soviet Union failed to pay its promised contribution to the UN, nearly causing the organization to go bankrupt since it took on so much debt to finance the operation? Well, because of this, the United States threatened to invoke Article 19 of the UN Charter against the USSR at this time to kick it out of the United Nations. So, the United Nations nearly collapsed because of this operation, not just once when it nearly failed to secure debt financing, but twice after one of the world's superpowers threatened to pursue kicking out the other, which certainly would have led to a complete breakdown. So, the UN learned that it ought not attempt such ambitious feats. I mean, the organization itself may have remained, but considering how the League of Nations fell without proper commitment from certain great powers in a multipolar world, just imagine how the UN would have fared in the Cold War when one of the two superpowers split from it. It would not have been pretty. In the end, the United Nations more or less chose to forget the lessons of the operation in the Congo. In 1991, a war in the Horn of Africa would immerse a new generation of peacekeepers in eerily similar and lethal conditions, leaving them to relearn that which was lost. But that will have to wait for another time. That concludes the United Nations operation in the Congo. In about a month, or however long it takes, I will return and take us back in time to the first ever armed UN peacekeeping mission. Thank you for listening to United for Peace. Next time, we will discuss the first United Nations emergency force, deployed to keep the Egyptians and the Israelis from slaughtering each other in the wake of the Second Arab-Israeli War.